to order the joint meeting of Glendale City Council and Glendale Housing Authority. May we have a roll call for council, please?
Council members Agajanian.
Present.
Devine.
Here.
Najarian.
Here.
Sinanian.
Here.
Mayor Garpetian.
Here.
For housing, please.
Authority members Agajanian.
Present.
Garpetian.
Here.
Najarian.
Here.
Parazian. Sinanian.
Here.
Chair Devine.
Here.
May we have your report, please?
The agenda for the December 5th, 2017 joint public meeting of the City Council and the Housing Authority was posted on Friday, December 1st, 2017 on the bulletin board outside City Hall. Before you is Director of Community Development regarding discussion of implementation of an affordable housing strategy. 1A is Housing Authority motion to receive and file report and to provide staff direction as deemed necessary. B is a City Council motion to receive and file report and to provide staff direction as deemed necessary.
Okay. Ms. Beers?
Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council, Housing Authority Chair Devine, and members of the Housing Authority. As Ms. Devine alluded to earlier, this is the item that we will be discussing this afternoon as it relates to a housing strategy for the City of Glendale, and staff has worked diligently to put forward a report that is comprehensive for the City Council and the Housing Authority. The purpose of the report today is to bring forward policy, hopefully direction and general themes, and receive direction from you as the City Council. See if there's any follow-up analysis that will be necessary to be able to provide information back to the City Council, and come for recommendations and implementation ultimately, and get an understanding of what that ultimate policy direction is. We also have David Jones, who's here from Sacramento, who will be talking about the housing bills and the packet that was before the legislature earlier this year. So with that, I will pass this on to Phil Lanzafame, Director of Community Development, who will start us with the actual report.
Okay. Bill?
Mr. Mayor, Madam Chairman, as was noted, the purpose of the report is to bring you back some policies. Really today we'll be looking for direction. Mr. Sinanian, you also kind of hinted at some of the problems we experience in Glendale, and through some meetings we had last summer, we were able to first and foremost, I think, acknowledge this is a statewide crisis. It's a state problem. Glendale's not going to fix it alone, but we do have a role in that, in some of these policies, or we want direction on some of these policies to help us with that. The meeting housing goals, I think I've told you before, in the community, the state of California is about 1 million units behind. 1 million housing units behind in the last decade. We just do not have enough housing to house all the people that are in our state. Increasing demand, development is becoming more and more difficult. We lost, all redevelopment agencies lost a significant funding source. The city of Glendale, between $8 and $9 million when redevelopment was dissolved. That was not replaced. We're going to talk a little bit about some of that coming back. And then just a lot of other pressures that go into the mix on this. We talked about the purpose and what we're going to need. This is a California problem. Our jobs are outpacing our output of housing, if you will. There is a greater demand, and that demand is being met by those that can afford the housing. The impact is where we're finding it: seniors, underemployed, and unemployed. And again, this is all throughout the state. Most of the projects, or most of the reports that you would see by experts, they call for increased housing production. It's simple when you say you're 1 million units behind to know that supply is not meeting demand. They also call for a balance between market and affordable housing. Many of the things that we're going to talk about today are geared at what we think is in our control, and that's affordable housing. It is a statewide issue. This is where we talked 80,000 homes a year over the last 10 years, a shortfall. There is a majority of California that is renting or that is paying more than 30%, and that's what we call affordable rent. 30% of your income, that's what you should pay for housing, including your rent and utilities. More than half of, or I should say a third of the people in the state pay more than half of their income. So they're overpaying by 20% of their income. Again, unstable funding, I would say, is really eliminated funding, is impeding our efforts. And I should, every chance I get, I will compliment this housing authority for the robust program you've had. We're going to count some numbers, and while we can all be very proud, you'll see where it's very difficult to build affordable housing and very expensive. But this agency has been one of the front runners in that. Home ownership rates, lowest they've been. We are in Glendale, 66, 67% renters. With the balanced homeowners, we're seeing that statewide. This is a snapshot of our market. This will look familiar to you from last summer. Household median income, $51,000. The home value is almost $600,000. A rule of thumb is to look at 2.5 times your income. That's the house you could afford. So that's somewhere $150,000, $160,000 for median income to be able to afford a house. Gross rent, $1,300, as we had pointed out last summer. That puts us right in the middle of the 88 cities in the county. We're not overly priced. We're not, a value bargain either. We're right in the middle. We are seeing, much like the state, 57% of our households are what we call cost burdened. They're paying more than 30% of their income for their home. And then here's the flip side of the renter. Households are occupied by 34%. This slide is a graphic that, again, this is from last summer, that really shows the dearth of housing in this area right here. $35,000 and less. There aren't the number of units to meet the households. When you start to move up the scale, 50, 75 and lower, there are plenty of homes, plenty of units to meet the households there. Then when you start to get to 150,000, 75 to 150,000, you go back to there's more households than there are units for that. This is where market rate housing may be a part of the solution. If there were more units that this group could afford and were desirable for them, they may be vacating they may be taken by some of these, which vacates these units for lesser incomes and trickle down. Talking a little bit about where we have been. This from 1975, when we started our affordable housing program. We have built almost 1,100 new rental units. They're broken down in this fashion between seniors, families, and special needs, whether physically or intellectually disabled peoples. New construction ownership, much more difficult to produce ownership. It costs more, but we've produced 114. This would include Dorn Gardens and many of the Habitat projects. Something that we are seeing as we go forward, the Housing Authority has invested $96 million in the development of these almost 1,200 units. We've leveraged almost $200 million, so almost 2 to 1. Money that we're putting in is being leveraged by private or other public funds. In development, we have our 66 rental units for seniors at 5th and Sonora, and then the 6 home ownership is a project with Habitat. Again, 2 to 1. Density bonus units, while they may wreak havoc on our zoning code and allow things that we otherwise wouldn't, the silver lining in that is we do have 123 rental units that were built, no home ownership, but 123 that have been built and now are being occupied as affordable. In development, we have 48 family units, and then there's 10 ownership units. In total, we look at everything that we do. we have Section 8 home, low mod housing, and now we have this new trust fund that we talked to about in our report. In total, we have created almost 1,200 new units. Almost 1,500 units. Through our Section 8 program, we serve 3,000. So you have almost 4,500 housing units that are somehow being supported by the Glendale Housing Authority. That represents about 6% of our total units. Now, that's an impressive number, 6%, but it's 6%, and you'd like to be, God, in a perfect world, 20% or more. But this is how much it costs. It's almost $300 million, over $300 million. And again, leveraging almost 2 to 1. Oh, I should say, back up one. This number of 4,500 does not include about 115 first-time home buyer loans that we have outstanding. These we didn't count because we don't know when they will mature. But right now you have 115 ownership restricted units as a result of programs of the Housing Authority. And then there's 50 outstanding single-family rehab loans. Those were made, we have a lot more that were made, but it would have taken quite a bit of research to go back to 1975. But this is what we still have outstanding. So there's another 165 units that are made affordable because of programs. The state legislature this past session just completed, they call their 15-bill housing package. It's probably the most targeted housing program that we've had in some time. It is the first response to the elimination of redevelopment almost 5 years ago. The legislature is aware of the crisis. As I say, there's about 15 bills. Some of them generate revenue. Others are more disciplinary in nature, and we'll go through those. I also should mention David Jones was kind enough to bring down the booklet that you have in front of you on the dais there. Was created by the League of California Cities to try and help explain this package. We're going to go through it, and if everything works out, we're going to be consistent with what's in the book there. The state housing package is broken up into two categories. Revenue, dedicated revenue to create housing, and then land use tools. SB 2 is a bill that will bring funding estimates around $250 million to the state. It adds a $75 fee on various real estate transaction documents. They are not on primary sale of properties and homes. In the first year, in 2018, those funds will be available on an application basis. That means we're not sure exactly how it's going to be distributed. Will probably be on a competitive basis. But that will allow us to do some zoning work, pre-planning for some of the tools in the other bills, as well as homeless assistance programs. In 2019 and going forward, 70% of those funds will be allocated to local governments like Glendale. Again, we're not sure how those will be distributed, whether it's competitive or it will be a direct distribution. That is something to come, and as Peter talks about the legislative platform, Glendale's, we'll want to keep busy at that. Some of the activities in here with SB2, pretty broad. You can develop affordable housing. You can do some of the acquisition, rehabilitation, and preservation as we were doing in the past. They are targeted to extremely low, very low, low, and moderate incomes. So all four of the income brackets, and as well as workforce housing. Workforce and moderate getting pretty close under this definition of 120% of average median income. Our housing element actually defines that up to 165% is workforce housing. Some of the other activities, matching funds that we have in our low mod housing fund, permanent supportive housing and homeless services. If we wanted to pursue that and combine it with other funds from the county. And something that was thrown in, it's also qualified to do projects among agencies, 2 or more agencies. We were very creative before in using new market tax credits. We did a deal with the city of Pasadena. This allows that funding to be used by 2 or more jurisdictions. SB 3 was adopted, which puts on the ballot, November 2018 ballot, a $4 billion bond. $1 billion of that would be set aside for veterans home loan programs and getting veterans into housing themselves, home ownership housing. The balance would be to a number of other programs, Cal Home Down Payment, some transit-oriented development, infrastructure that supports infill housing. So that would be something, again, that we will probably have to compete for. How that's being distributed, not yet set with the legislature. The second kind of category is utilization of land use tools. There are 12 bills in this category. Some of them provide tools for us. Others are punitive and require us to do things that should force affordable housing to take place. They are all designed to stimulate growth by facilitating private market development of affordable housing, increasing local accountability for meeting your regional housing needs numbers, leveraging private funding to pay for affordable housing, and then to preserve affordable housing of those that are currently being subsidized. Probably the big gorilla in this was SB 35. This was what was formerly known as the Buy a Right package. The governor introduced it last year, and that was really to take away local control from local jurisdictions and say, if you meet the code, you can build it. The permits become ministerial, generally speaking. What this bill does is they call it a streamlined approval process. It takes certain areas that don't meet RENA numbers, regional area housing numbers, in the different income categories. And if you don't meet those those production standards, then a developer could say, by right, I want to build housing that includes an affordable component. Those numbers, those income categories include moderate, low, very low, and extremely low. I'm not sure that there is any city that meets their RENA numbers in the lower income categories, because we don't have enough money to build all of our need, and the private sector is building for sale housing. So everybody's going to be kind of caught up in this. One of the things that staff believes in analyzing this, because what also was put along with this is affordable housing will streamline it, and so you should save some costs, is a requirement to pay prevailing wage. That prevailing wage may just take up all of the savings, and so I don't know how many developers will take advantage of this. I suppose there are some that would say, you know what, if we're getting affordable housing, it's worth the pain. I think we would, and the city council supported the ability to maintain local control and build affordable housing as we would like to. SB 540 is another program that streamlines. This was sponsored by the league, and it takes a more positive approach to it. It said, if you'd like, you can create these districts. You can do all the pre-planning. You can set all of the development standards, and then developers can come in and build to those standards that you have already pre-approved. It provides some funding to do that planning, as well as environmental review. There are some nuances to AB 73. It is basically the Assembly's partner to SB 540. where you set up districts, you do some pre-planning, and then the development community can then take advantage of that and streamline their process, getting production of units faster. AB 1505 is an important one for cities and will be a main point in your discussion later on. This is a bill that, in effect, overturns the Palmer decision, which precludes cities from adopting inclusionary housing rules for rental property. So this bill allows cities now to go back to what the ability they had before and adopt inclusionary housing. That is, for every home that gets built in every project, X% needs to be affordable at some level. The local jurisdiction can set that. It codifies this and allows it to be imposed on rental housing. Palmer precluded us from that as a form or a violation, I should say, of the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act. This replaces that. So we will be asking you your preference on inclusionary housing or other tools. I would say at this point, Glendale adopted an inclusionary housing ordinance for the San Fernando Road redevelopment project area. At the time that project area was adopted, redevelopment law required it. So it has been on our books. With Palmer, we did not enforce the rental aspect of it, and in fact, we didn't have any projects that were to be built. After 2010, we couldn't impose it. With this law, January 1, 2018, that ordinance, our own ordinance, will go back into effect. We are still trying to determine the number of units. We think there's 3 projects, and Peter can talk about that more. But it is an important, it's an important piece, and there will be some junctures that need to be taken, some decisions need to be made with that. There's a whole bunch of other bills that were on there. Again, most of these were punitive. They were noticing that affordability covenants were expiring. They were reporting to make sure that HCD knows how many units we're building and what have you, their land inventory. So some of them, they're things that we're going to do, we already have to do, we don't have a choice. The one, though, that I want to spend a little time, and I'm going to take a pause and give it to the city attorney, is the Housing Accountability Act. These 2 bills, SB 167 and AB 678, they added to an existing act, existing law that makes it even more important for us to heed the guidelines of that act. So I'll give it to Mike to talk a little bit about that.
Thanks, Phil. Members of council, members of the Housing Authority. The 2 bills, SB 167 and AB 678, amend the Government Code, Section 65589.5, which is also known as the Housing Accountability Act. And that law applies to both all projects, so market rate and affordable, and then there are some special provisions for just affordable projects. But in essence, what it requires is that when a project complies with all the objective general plan and zoning standards, it limits the ability of local jurisdictions, cities, and counties to deny those projects or condition them in such a way as to render them infeasible unless the agency that has land use control over them can find that the project will have a substantial adverse impact on public health or safety. So there are different types of conditions or different reasons that a city may deny a project. A lot of them fall within public welfare, but the statute before they were amended already required that for cities to make these findings that the projects may have substantial impacts on health and safety, which is a higher standard. For example, we have some of our ARs in the last few years which have identified impacts to police services or police and fire services that might be a basis for example, to deny it or to reduce the density, require reduced density to approve that project. So that the statute requires that before a council denies a project or requires a lower density, that it make that finding, and in addition, that there's no other way to mitigate that particular impact. What these two statutes do is, in addition to imposing those requirements, they give courts a little bit more remedy power in the event that local agencies violate those statutes. One of them being that obviously they can order compliance. In certain circumstances, they can require public agencies to, they can actually themselves approve a particular project if it complies with their general plan and zoning standards. There's overplay or interplay with CEQA, but again, sometimes if the city or county cannot make a finding, one of those findings, it may have to adopt a statement of overrides and approve that particular project. The other notable aspect of these statutes is that it raises the burden that the city has to meet to deny a particular project, whereas before it was under the substantial evidence test. In other words, the city could identify some evidence by which to make its finding, then it would be able to survive a legal challenge. Now it's changed it to preponderance of evidence, which the lawyers will tell you it's actually, the city will actually have the burden to show that a project is causing one of these impacts. So those are the legislature has continued to up the ante in terms of the burdens that imposes on local agencies in reviewing these projects and considering them and either denying them or imposing conditions. So that's generally what the Housing Accountability Act does and how these two bills strengthen them.
Quick question. These are for the projects that comply with zoning code and the general plan.
Correct.
And let's say if you can build 20 units and the city says, no, we don't feel that, we can't find the findings or what have you, we want to reduce the numbers to 15, then the burden is on the city to prove that that project is detrimental to the
Health or safety.
Health or safety. So these are, again, for the projects that are
Comply with general plan and
general
zoning.
plan and zoning. Thank you. Mr. Najjar.
Thank you. I think that's just wrong. It really usurps the local authority in determining what's best for our community in terms of a lot of the intangibles that we take into when we decide something like that. So it's a preponderance of the evidence, but as any fact finder would know, or anyone who's advised a judge before, soon to be aired, it depends how much weight you give to any particular piece of evidence, and that is completely subjective. It can depend on the credibility. Let's say you think there's a really bad traffic impact, but the developer brings in this shyster traffic engineer. It's certainly within our discretion to say, well, we don't believe what you're saying, that the traffic impacts are not going to be significant. We believe someone else, a bit of evidence that says that it's going to be worse. So we would say, hypothetically, the housing authority or the council could say, we think that this is going to have a substantial impact, therefore we deny. Aren't we within our power to do that? I mean, it still seems very vague and very squishy as to the standard that they've set.
I think, Mr. Mayor, members of council, Councilmember Najarian, what I think this statute does, the two amendments, what I think they do is they will require cities to just go through a few more steps to identify, if the traffic study that you cite in your example truly is without evidentiary foundation, it'll require the city to identify how it is so, versus before these statutes, it simply required the city to put forth its own traffic study to show that there is, for example, significant impact.
So is that going to hog tie us in a sense?
It's unknown at this time because they're brand new and there's no, you're going to have to wait to see if there's a project that complies with all the standards and where there's clearly evidence that that project is going to have a significant impact on public health or safety. Then we'll sort of cross that bridge when we come to it.
I think we should send a letter to our elected representatives and let them know that these are our concerns, that it usurps the authority of the locally elected officials. This is, it's already voted for and all that, right. But I still think we should let them know that, just so they have that in their
And I do believe,
record.
as these bills were making their way, we did individually and then through the League of Cities, expressed our concerns with the, as you described it, usurpation of local authority.
I mean, especially, I don't know how Ms. Friedman voted, but she sat on this board with us, and she understands the importance of having locally controlled development and projects. I hope she didn't vote for this.
No, Democrats all voted in favor of it, so.
So she did vote for it.
Well,
Okay.
we don't know that, so let's
We
let's
heard
not.
it from
Democrats voted for it.
Mr. Aguirre.
So at this
Okay, I have
point,
a question. I'm sorry, I have a question. Those two laws related to every housing project or only to affordable housing projects?
The provisions regarding the city having the burden to prove that there's public health or safety impact applies to all projects.
Okay,
Every housing project.
Correct.
okay. Are you done, Mr.
Yeah.
City Attorney?
and so,
Mr. Lansdowne,
Mr.
if you
Mayor,
wanna continue and
at this
finish?
point, I would like to introduce David Jones. If you have any specific housing questions, David is with Emmanuel Jones, our lobbyist in Sacramento. If you have specific questions on that, and then we want to go into the strategy itself and the tools and places where we need direction.
Well, I have sort of a broad question. Is Sacramento any closer to taking upon itself the responsibility of funding the solution to this crisis as opposed to just foisting it upon the municipalities to bear the burden, both the administrative and financial burden of dealing with this?
Well, we're caught in this bad Venn diagram where the governor doesn't want to spend any more money. The legislature would spend billions of dollars on affordable housing if they could, but the governor is saying no. The most important thing in his legacy is not to leave a deficit to his successor. So the pleas from Democrats to spend more money on homelessness, affordable housing, have all gone unheeded by the governor. So we're not going to get any more money. The only thing that they can do, and it's back to they do punitive legislation. Sacramento, I know it's not going to surprise you, runs by anecdote. So if they can find a picture of a city that did something egregious on affordable housing, that's the rule that they're going to make for all the good actors as well. So the Housing Accountability Act was a series of things that cities did rather foolishly that made the press top of the fold stories, and then we get the Housing Accountability Act for good actors like Glendale and others that are doing the right thing. We have to live with it. So the governor's office was famous for saying he did the buy right proposal that Phil mentioned earlier. His director of housing said, we've figured out that CEQA adds 5% to the cost of any project. Local control and zoning and aesthetics adds 7%. So we can remove 12%, we can eliminate local environmental review and local input. I can save 12% on every housing project. That's the mindset of Sacramento. Not to do the funding and provide the solution, and as you are painfully aware, the elimination of redevelopment, as Phil mentioned earlier, that was the biggest single funding source for affordable housing. $1.1 billion a year, leverage 7 to 1. It was about $10 billion a year that was going to affordable housing in the state of California that overnight disappeared in 2012. So the package that was put forward, the funding side of it is rather anemic. I don't expect to see a huge amount of money coming to Glendale from SB2. The housing bond is going to be a one-time shot of revenue. So as far as your question goes, they broke the magic machine, the golden goose that fixed affordable housing, and now they find themselves in a world of hurt when we've got this huge housing shortage, and the people that are there, many of them have turned out, but they voted to get rid of redevelopment, and that's what caused a lot of the problems that we're facing. So if it's okay, I'll kind of give you kind of a quick overview. If there's any questions, I'll be happy to answer them at the end, but I'll kind of tell you kind of what's coming down the pike for next year and give you a little crystal ball gazing. The funding packages, as Phil mentioned, and the staff report is excellent, very comprehensive. And this document I would call your attention to if you have further questions. The League just put this out last week. Very comprehensive document, get and answer some of your questions. But package this year was historic. They finally have gotten the fact people are dying in the streets, homelessness is exploding. Sacramento has finally started to realize that housing is indeed a statewide crisis, and housing remains near the top, if not the top, of the agenda in Sacramento. Package falls into three categories: the funding, things mentioned, streamlining, and then accountability. Many of the measures up there were entirely punitive towards local government, saying we found some story of somebody doing something wrong, so there's going to be a bill. There were 130 bills introduced this last session on housing. So that's more than one bill for every legislator had a bill on housing. 15 were signed by the governor. That means that there's about 105 or so left over that are still vehicles. So is housing and land use and all these things going to be on the agenda? Of course it will. Homelessness, big problem. So we're going to see a lot of further stirring of the pot in this area. Redevelopment 2.0, there's been a lot of discussion of members that were not in that building when redevelopment was eliminated. A lot of those members are being bold and saying, we need to bring this back. We need to bring not exactly your father's redevelopment agency, but some form of redevelopment needs to come back. We need to give local governments a tool to do something. I'm not sure this governor would entertain it after he was the one who vetoed it or got rid of it, but still it's an encouraging sign that there will be a different governor 12 months from now, and so we have an opportunity to somehow lay the groundwork of have redevelopment come back. RENA reform, there's talk about what RENA reform would mean. Nobody's meeting RENA. It's kind of a joke, so there's a lot of calls for having some tinkering with RENA, and I'm not sure exactly what direction that will be, but that's rumored in the building. SB 35, the bill dealing with the by right, we know there's cleanup language coming to it. The author he knows he didn't get it exactly right, so we'll be seeing SB 35 cleanup. Further limitation on our ability to require parking. Many affordable housing developers say the biggest problem is the amount of parking that you local governments require per bedroom. So I expect there to be legislation that we probably won't like that will tie your hands further on how many parking spaces you require. Also, ADUs, alternative dwelling units, granny units, we expect there to be legislation to give those projects additional legs up. So they're going to try to make ADUs, granny units, easier to do. So again, more local control will slip out of our hands, but as mentioned before, we're desperate for need for affordable housing. Pro tem change, we're expecting to see Kevin De Leon, the rule is when you are running for a different office besides Senate in the legislature, you should give up the pro temship. So he has not said he wants to do that, but depending on who takes that spot, whether it's Senator Toni Atkins from San Diego, huge affordable housing advocate, she was the author of SB 2, that could have a different dynamic on leveraging the governor and asking for more money for affordable housing. The big city mayors, we know they've been meeting and they are going to be putting a big push for a huge amount of money with a B attached to it, leveraging the governor and trying to pressure the governor to put a one-time chunk of the $7 billion surplus Sacramento has towards homelessness and homeless prevention. So we'll be watching Mayor Garcetti and others pushing for that package out of the governor, and we'll see what they come up with. The word is it's not just going to be for those big cities. There's going to be some money for everyone. So we'll stand by and watch that. SB 2, as mentioned before, that legislation, we have the 70% of the money in year 2 will go on the CDBG formula. So we know, once we know how big the pot of money is, which we don't really have a good clue, we know that Glendale will get a certain percentage of that money. But again, I'm not sure it's going to be a life-changing amount of money compared to what we used to get with redevelopment. SB 3 is the housing bond in November. Your staff report covers it. There are some opportunities in there, assuming the voters would pass it, particularly for us. $300 million for local housing trust funds matching dollar for dollar. So since you have a housing trust fund, there will be an opportunity there down the pike for that. $300 million for infill development for infrastructure. So there are some pots of that bond that I think will be very attractive to you. With that, I think I'll stop and answer questions or see if there's anything I can do.
Any questions?
Just
Mr. Alexander.
You just mentioned SB 2 will not bring lots of money, so we know because the total money will be like $300 million, so it's not. But SB 3 should bring lots of money to Glendale, isn't it?
It's $1 billion. It's a $4 billion bond,
Right.
one time. $1 billion is for veterans. So that's CalVet program. So that's not coming directly to Glendale, though we may have some opportunities there. But of the $3 billion that's left, $1.5 billion goes to HCD for a program that we're probably not going to be competing for. So it really, looking at what the pots of money are, we'll have to, sharpen our pencils. I'm sure there'll be something, but it's only one time. So, and they'll probably dole it out slowly, as they typically do. HCD will get the authority to get $3 billion worth of bonding authority. They'll probably only bond for a couple $100 million at a time. So we'll look for opportunities, but I'm not sure $3 billion statewide doled out over time, we're going to be seeing millions and millions of dollars coming to Glendale. We may be wrong, but I mean, and we'll do everything we can to take advantage of every opportunity. But I'm not really expecting that one-time money to be a giant game changer here.
Thank you.
I have a question. You said that there may be a movement to make ADUs easier to do. Do you have any idea what that would mean?
Not really. I mean, we're in this kind of legislative hiatus right now. They're all out doing what they do as legislators, and January they return. So we will start seeing bills put across the desk January. So this is just talking to all the housing consultants and the lobbyists in the housing world, saying, "What have you heard?" So don't know any details, but we'll let you know as soon as we do.
Mr. Najarian, questions? No? I have a couple of questions. For the public to know, RHNA numbers means regional housing need allocation. Is that what RHNA? Regional
housing needs
assessment. Okay. And that SB2, I think this was it was called SB 1335, if I'm not mistaken. It was pushed by the California Association of Realtors like for last few years. And one of the issues that the realtors had with this bill was exactly what's going on today, and we don't know what percentage of this funding is going to come to Glendale, and we wanted to make sure at least half of the funds generated by Glendale will come back to Glendale. And I think this is yet another bill that it's open-ended in the beginning. It sounds good, and we all jumped the gun and support it and asked the voters to vote for it and support it, but we get the short end of the stick, and I think that's wrong. And you also mentioned that some of these new regulations or like the SB 1550 or 167, are they getting rid of the CEQA requirements? Is that what you said? Or they are the EIR? You mentioned something about not requesting or not requiring the CEQA.
Some of the bills are accountability, and they don't deal with the CEQA issues. Streamlining bills like SB 35 does remove CEQA from the equation. So if you have a place zoned for housing, somebody knocks on your door and says, "I'm going to do an extremely low-income housing project." Glendale does not have the RHNA numbers of extremely low-income housing stock. I found this piece of property at 6th and Brand that's zoned for residential development. They would be able to have the right to build their project, as long as it was a RHNA number project, and correct me if I'm misstepping, but they would be able to come in and knock on your door and say, "No aesthetics, no environmental review, no parking requirements, we're building this." But what Phil mentioned, and I think is really the godsend for most of us, is that none of these projects will pencil out. None of them would pencil out without a ginormous subsidy, and especially, I mean, in the low income and extremely low income, they're going to need somebody with a big checkbook to make these things pencil out, and they have to do prevailing wage. So none of these things are really going to be coming darkening your door, in our view, from most places around the state, because they simply will not pencil out. So the likelihood of you having people coming to your city saying, I want this, I have no local input, no design review, no environmental input, they're not going to pencil out. So economics will keep this bill from impacting us.
That's SB 35 you mentioned?
Yeah.
And
So-
it's passed already?
Signed.
That's signed. But again, it has to, in order to qualify for that streamlining, Mr. Mayor, As Dave mentioned, most cities that haven't met the RENA numbers for below moderate, that project not only does have to pay prevailing wage, but it has 50% of that has to be affordable to households at 80% area median income or less. So that's why it wouldn't pencil out. On top of that, they have to pay prevailing wage. For those agencies that haven't met their above moderate income, the thresholds are lower, but Glendale, like many areas in the region, have met our RENA numbers in that category. So it's going to be very hard for projects to take advantage of that particular statute in Glendale.
Okay. Any more questions? Well,
And just so council knows, Mr. Jones will be back, I believe, January 23rd of 2018 for a legislative update at that time. That's what we're hoping.
It might not be me, but it might be Kira. You'll get my better half.
Yes, one of you will be here,
Yes.
hopefully end of January at some time. So,
okay.
thank you.
I have 2 speaker cards. If
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, Mr.
you
Mayor.
still have,
We would like to go into the housing strategy and present that to you and then speakers, unless you would like to hear them on the
no, that's
legislative
fine.
package. And then,
Let's go to housing strategy
Okay.
first.
then Peter will take from here and go through. Peter, just before you do start, I think you all have a scorecard, if you will. It is, should be on your desk, that has all of the items that we would like direction on. I know sometimes it isn't easy to get specific and clear and precise direction, but we're hoping that this organizes thoughts and will work as a bit of a roadmap and a check so that we get all of the information, we can go do our work and then come back with the final strategy. So we'll be referring back to that most likely near the end if there's areas that we have holes.
Okay.
Members of the City
Mr. Zoe.
Council Housing Authority. So you've received some information in terms of some historical background about the production of affordable housing in Glendale in the past. You've now heard what the state actions have been in 2017 and some of the things we anticipate for 2018. So we're now going to talk a little bit about what that possibly could mean then for Glendale and some type of affordable housing strategy moving forward. And much like the state's approach, the Glendale strategy is dealing with the same types of categories. We want to be able to look at some dedicated revenue, whether or not there are additional land use tools that could be put into place, and then the work that could be done under a legislative platform. And this diagram kind of highlights and illustrates how they all interact with each other. So with that, if a project were to come in or a proposal were to come in today and the question were to come up, how much money do we have in our affordable housing funds? This is the answer to it. And what we've done is we've broken this category up into our 2 traditional sources of funds that we've had. One is being home funds, which is a federal source of funds from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. LMIHAF is the former redevelopment 20% set-aside funds. It's now under a new name, and there's some residual funding under there, and something we're going to talk about called housing trust funds. So at the end of the 2016-2017 fiscal year, we had about $1.4 million in home funds available for a future project. Coming into this fiscal year, we had an additional $1.4 million added to that fund for new development. There are a significant number of restrictions that come with home funds. You cannot bank home funds for long periods of time. It's either use it or lose it type of programming. For low mod income housing asset funds, or I should say, and for the home funds, the interesting thing going on at the federal level right now is that our allocations have gone historically from about $2 million per year at the high to now we're receiving the last few years about $900,000 a year in allocation. So it's been reduced at the federal level. 2018 calls for, at least from the administration, for it to be eliminated completely, along with CDBG funding. And so that's a concern. Whether or not that will happen remains to be seen. At this point, for the 2 future years going out of 2018-19 and 19-20, we budgeted about $700,000. We do expect some type of hit to come. Whether or not this will be the amounts, we'll see. Low mod income housing asset fund, $2.8 million at the end of last fiscal year. This current fiscal year, another $1.2 million in funding deposited into that. We expect about another $1.2 million in 18-19 And in 1920, this very large number here, the housing bonds that the City Council and former redevelopment agency had put into place, about $8.7 million, if things go well, in low moderate income housing asset fund money that will be brought forward in terms of this bond, putting a significant amount of money into the pot here. After 2019-20, there's really not much projected. What you'll probably see is a number a little bit lower than about $1 million, and that's just going to represent program income that we're receiving on some of our existing loans. And then what you have here, this new column here, and I'll explain to you what it is, Housing Trust Fund. And we hadn't had it previously. We always anticipated some type of third source of funding going on, and it only happened recently. This $2.19 million, that, if you recall, that represents the amount of money that 2 affordable senior housing projects, both sponsored by Southern California Presbyterian Homes, Costa de la Paloma, I take that back, Park Paseo, and Maple Parks Apartments. They were refinancing under a 4% bond program that's allowed to them. Their projects, older projects, getting close to the expiration of their affordability period, but the developer's mission is affordable housing, so they didn't want to convert it to market rate housing. So they took advantage of the 4% bond program, and they refinanced, and they were able to pay us back off our assistance to the project, and yet rehab their buildings and extend out the affordability for another 55 years. So we received $2.2 million back on those projects. And then this $250,000 is a deposit of money we anticipate to receive related to a hotel project proposed over on the corner of Wilson, and that was a $250,000 payment that was promised to be made to go towards affordable housing. We're going to talk about this a little bit later on. Right now, though, there are no necessarily program regulations associated with this housing trust fund. If and when we get to the point that we may need these funds for a project, we would want to have a discussion as to coming up with some program parameters for the use of that fund. It'll require consulting with the city attorney's office, making sure that the revenue that was generated from those 2 affordable housing projects are consistent with the intent that the payment was made. So right now, project comes in. How much do we have available for a project? It would be this amount, 6.5 plus the 2.6, approximately $9.1 million we would have available for the next project or projects. And it does not include any possible revenue from the 2 housing bills at the state level, SB2 and SB3. So with that revenue description comes up a couple of policy considerations that we'd like to at least maybe initiate right now and then continue at a later meeting if necessary. But with that amount of money that we have available, is there a desire to target specific neighborhoods for future affordable housing projects? Or should projects be reserved really on a first-come, first-served basis, citywide, regardless of location? In prior times when we had about $9 million in set-aside money, $2 million in home, we had the ability to reserve some money for neighborhoods and then apply the rest on a citywide basis to be able to catch some of those projects and properties that might not fit our criteria but are worthy of consideration. So the question before you today would be, with that amount of money that we do have and do anticipate moving forward, is there a desire to target neighborhoods with some or all of it, or because of the housing situation as it is to just really take a look at first property available, first proposal that's feasible, let's consider it on that type of basis. And that leads into the second question, whether or not there's a desire to prioritize rental developments moving forward over home ownership development. Over the years, we've talked to you about this. Rental development tends to have the most availability of other sources of funds to be able to finance and is less expensive for us to be able to do that. Home ownership is very expensive, and there are not many sources of funds. For rental development, at least we could look towards the 9% tax credit program to try and help. As difficult as it is, it does bring in a significant amount of funding to help make these projects work, and allows us to be able to stretch our funding even further for multiple projects as opposed to one project. To the degree possible, because I did mention that there are some regulations associated with home funds as to the types of categories that you, in terms of people that you spend the money on, similar with low mod income housing asset funds, whether or not there's a desire to program the funding towards senior development, family development, special need developments, or versus considering projects as they're being proposed by either staff, by developers that come along. Every developer has a specialty that they tend to service, some seniors, some developmentally or physically disabled, and some families. And then, also the sites might dictate one population over another, depending upon where they are in town. Whether or not there's a desire to establish a rotation of project type and population served. And then, as I mentioned earlier, and then trying to develop some guidelines for the Housing Trust Fund. So in addition to the revenue that we've highlighted then that we have locally, there is the possibility of some funding coming in from SB2 and SB3. We need to continue to work with our legislators, our lobbyists, and other advocates on that funding, those two funding sources, to be able to help craft something that we might be able to take advantage of. As David mentioned, SB2 is in year 2 intended to have a portion of that money allocated out to cities. We're not expecting very much, just based upon the history of how other funding has been allocated out by the state and by the county. SB3 is a bond program, and as David mentioned, that's something that we're going to have to be applying, and most likely they'll have cycles that you'll be able to apply for, and there might be projects we have that may not fit into cycles that they are setting up. So it's going to be difficult. Timing would always have to be right to be able to take advantage of all the sources in one particular project. But it's something that, moving forward, we're going to have to focus on so that when there is revenue and the timelines do allow, we have to be able to take advantage of that. So there's another source of revenue that we'd like to touch on today and then maybe get some feedback and come back to the authority at a later meeting, is whether or not there's a desire to implement a development impact fee for affordable housing. Much like the impact fee you have for parks and libraries facilities, so to date generated approximately $16 million in revenue, whether or not there's a desire to establish, conduct a study and establish a fee for affordable housing. The ability is there to establish it both for new residential projects that come before the city, as well as commercial projects. One thing, and the benefits of that is that funding like that is locally generated and is locally controlled. You're not applying at the state level for that. It's all within the control of the Housing Authority to be able to dictate and program and budget. As I mentioned, there needs to be, in order to have that impact fee established, there needs to have a nexus study that needs to be conducted, and at which time the nexus study will attempt to address other questions that come up with trying to implement a development impact fee. And if there is some interest in doing that, at this point, we'd like to receive some direction as to whether or not it'd be appropriate, and now's the right time for staff to contract out with an economic consultant to be able to start that nexus study, then bring it back before the City Council and the Housing Authority to receive that study, analyze what some of the issues are, and then make some decisions on moving forward with a source like that. Some of the questions that would be coming back before the Housing Authority and City Council would be the amount of the fee for residential and commercial uses, whether or not there's even a desire to apply to commercial uses. A number of cities have development impact fees. Up north is where you tend to see commercial uses subject to the impact fee. There's a concern by some agencies that with the elimination of redevelopment and the need to want to go ahead and try and prioritize new commercial activities coming into cities, there's that question as to whether or not an impact fee on a commercial use may be something that would be counter to redevelopment, economic development priorities. So it's a discussion to be had. Whether or not any new fee should be implemented over time or phased in slowly or just set immediately, and considerations like that would be for developers that have particular projects in a pipeline and or commercial businesses that are in some type of development process. Whether or not there are any exemptions that might be applied to a future fee, what the income levels you would want to serve with that fee, much like the discussion we will need to be having on the Housing Trust Fund. And whether or not, one thing you cannot do, though, with regards to a development impact fee, if it applies to residential, you cannot then have an inclusionary zoning ordinance on residential. Because if developer would argue, you're hitting me twice. You're telling me I have to include affordable housing at a certain level in my project, and it's on me to provide that, and then you're also providing me and hitting me with an impact fee that says my project has an impact that it supposedly is being negotiated or at least alleviated through the inclusionary zoning. So it has to be one or the other. So that doesn't mean, though, you're not allowed to have an impact fee. You could go back to the idea of the commercial impact fee, because there is a nexus that could be made that commercial uses do have an impact on affordable housing in general, and more so on affordable housing. So you could look at having an impact fee for, if not for residential, at least for commercial, and then look at having an inclusionary zoning ordinance for the residential component.
So you're not precluding having both, just for, make sure that they're identified and described so that it doesn't appear to be, or it isn't a double fee?
Correct. You're not precluded. You're just prohibited, though, from having it both on residential. And the other item in terms of a dedicated revenue would be an in lieu fee, and that in lieu fee is associated with the land use tool of inclusionary zoning. And in one of the bills that Phil discussed, inclusionary zoning is now allowed to be implemented or administered in cities on a rental product. But what the state did say is that they also required, and it was a common practice, but they made it a point to work it into the law, that agencies must offer developers an option of not necessarily building the units. So in that place comes an in lieu fee. So the developer has the ability to build the units into their project or pay a fee, and then the agency would be responsible for building that. So if the inclusionary zoning ordinance is a direction that the city council would like to go then there will be discussion on an in lieu fee associated with that. So another source of revenue that could be coming in. And again, another source that's locally controlled, locally generated. And so that leads into the land use tool of inclusionary zoning ordinance. And so as you heard, it's a legal standard requiring the inclusion of affordable units in new development projects. Recent studies support that inclusionary programs are a tool in producing affordable housing. It's a statewide, nationwide phenomena. It's very popular in California, particularly in Northern California. We do have agencies in Southern California, Pasadena, Santa Monica, and West Hollywood that have it. In our discussions with staff, LA County is looking at implementing it too. They'll be coming back to the supervisors with some recommendations for affordable housing in 2018, and inclusionary is one thing they're looking at as well. There are questions then, much like the development impact fee, that would come up and would be a discussion we would have to have if there is if the authority is inclined to look at inclusionary zoning. And they're very similar to the development impact fee questions. You know, percent levels to set aside for affordable housing. Is that inclusionary requirement a 10% requirement, a 15% requirement, something less, something more than 15? If it is more than 15, coincidentally, when the state passed the law allowing inclusionary zoning, they also did not want to undo some of the laws that they put into place that they felt were promoting housing development. So they didn't want an agency to then come up with a very large inclusionary number that they felt would then stifle development, which was their intent all along. So if you try to come up with a percentage above 15%, that actually has to go through the state for review. And they will look at the findings that have been made in the studies to determine whether or not that's really being used as a tool to address affordable housing or as a tool to prevent future development in an agency.
You mentioned 15%?
1.5.
Okay.
1.5. That's the magic number for the state level.
In order to do this, would we need to, for this ordinance, would we need to hire a consultant for this?
Same consultant you would
process?
hire for the impact fee
Impact
would
fees
be
would
the
be this one?
consultant that would be able to produce the inclusionary zoning study as well.
Yeah, for the in lieu fee. For the in lieu
For
fee.
the in lieu fee portion of the inclusionary zoning, and some program design of the inclusionary zoning ordinance as well. Type of project you'd wish it to apply to, is it new construction, is it rehab? Would you like to see rental development provided, ownership development? the affordability control periods you'd want to put into place, whether or not there are any other options of not building the units beyond in lieu fees, such as an off-site development elsewhere. If the developer has 2 properties and they would like to have the market rate units in one location, they'll provide a property and/or promise to develop the units in another property. There's that ability. Land dedication. And then some of the other things that go along with that, the eventual marketing and tenant selection criteria. And then one thing we thought we would bring up and touch on is that with SB 1818, the density bonus, the question was asked whether or not a developer who is subject to an inclusionary zoning requirement, could they take advantage of SB 1818 and satisfy that requirement? And it could be done. Actually, I believe it must be allowed.
Let me clarify that. So after Palmer came down, there was a subsequent case in Northern California involving the city of Napa. That was sort of the open question about if the city was requiring a certain percentage to be set aside for affordable units, could the developer use that percentage towards the threshold to trigger SB 1818? And the court held that yes, the developer could. So that's just one factor to consider in designing the inclusionary zoning ordinance. And I think if you give us direction to bring it back, Peter has lots of examples of some cities that are still doing it regardless of that fact because they still want the affordable units. There's still that benefit to try to get those affordable units, even if you have to provide some additional density or some of those incentives that are allowed under SB 1818.
So let me just ask a follow-up question. So if you are, by code, you're allowed to build 50 units, let's say, we require 15% inclusionary housing, which is affordable housing. Then they can come back and say, since I'm providing 15% affordable housing, I can use the SB 1818 and use the variances that I can get for height, density, parking, or what have you, because they have 2 variances with no public hearing and then 2 other variances based on administrative exemption.
Incentives, correct.
So, incentives.
Yeah.
So they can provide the inclusionary housing for 15%, but they can use SB 1818 to get the incentives.
Assuming that they're building those units on site. So if for example, you have an applicant who would rather pay the in lieu fee, then they wouldn't get the SB 1818 bonus. So that'll be something the council may want to take into consideration if we come back with the program and how that's designed.
And the follow-up question on if they're not building it on site, they have another site, they want to develop it. Is there a time limit as to if they start this project, when would they be required to start the other project? If they're not building it on site, they want to build the unit somewhere else.
That would be a program design feature we would want to have a discussion on and then implement if the ordinance were something that the authority.
You generally want to tie the 2 together though, so that the market rate project isn't getting built and then the city's stuck trying to enforce on the affordable project.
Okay.
And if I can ask another question on that, if they use SB 1818 and our inclusionary zoning ordinance is 15%, do they have to do the 15% or can they do SB 1818, whatever that is?
Well, they would have to do the 15%, but then they could use those numbers to meet the minimum thresholds to trigger the benefits of SB 1818.
Okay. And can I assume that 15% would be more than if they just...
It's a sliding scale, right? So if you do very low at 5%, you get the minimum, you get the density bonus plus 1 incentive, and then you go up a percentage. If it's 10% low, I think you get the minimum density bonus, and then it's a sliding scale going upwards for the density bonus and incentive. So answer generally yes, depending how you design. And again, it's a project design feature. It'll depend how you design it.
And that 15% would be based on the base. So if it's a 100-unit project initially, that 15% would be on the base, not on the piece that they would get as part of SB 1818.
That's what, yeah.
Not on the density.
Correct.
Right.
On the
Bonus
bonus.
density.
Correct.
That would be better then. Yeah.
One thing for you to keep in mind is you get to set the percentage.
Right.
So if you set your inclusionary lower than SB 1818, they could take advantage of to that point, or add more units and get more density. Conversely, if you set your inclusionary higher than the 15% in SB 1818, they would always qualify but you'd have a higher limit
Right.
for,
That's what I
so that's something that you'll have some flexibility and need to think about.
Okay. Are you, okay, go. Let's finish the presentation so I
Okay.
can go.
And so one other program design would be whether or not the inclusionary zoning ordinance is citywide or specific neighborhoods. And we say neighborhoods because we go back to the fact that when we did have redevelopment, we had one of our two project areas, the San Fernando Road project corridor, that project area was subject to inclusionary zoning required under redevelopment. And in response to that, when the city council rezoned San Fernando for housing, they also implemented the inclusionary zoning ordinance to go with that. And it wasn't too long after that that the court challenge came in that you couldn't apply it to rental. So we have inclusionary zoning on the books. We have it both for ownership and rental. It applies to projects, brand new projects in the San Fernando corridor. We've never been able to implement it on a renter side. We've not had anyone propose ownership units in the meantime. But now that beginning January 1st, that ordinance will be back in effect and will be applicable to projects that haven't pulled building permits to this point. And so we would need to start to go look at those projects that are in the pipeline, where they are in the pipeline, and whether or not the developers need to be made aware that this new, well, it's an existing ordinance, has just been reaffirmed by the state is now applicable to their project.
And what's our inclusionary percentage? Is it 15%?
15%, of which 9% needs to be low and or moderate, and 6% needs to be very low. And then there's an in lieu fee associated with it that the council adopted back at that time. It was originally proposed at $39 a square foot. It was adopted at $17 a square foot, and it's remained that.
And I didn't have anything to do with that. There was a big fight we had at that time.
Well, there was,
about-
yeah, and there was a discussion about policy. The rezone of San Fernando was brand new, and there was this desire to see housing in there, and they were in discussion about whether or not $39 was going to limit the amount of development they wanted to see, and it came down to 17.
But I think to Peter's point, if, come January 1st, we might have some projects where we might have to apply that to. So if council wants us to take a time out on that before while we consider the citywide question, we'll need some direction so we can bring something back in January, February, I presume.
Another land use tool will be the South Glendale Community Plan. And much like some of the language in some of the state bills that Phil had discussed, looking at implementing some specific workforce housing incentive zones in the South Glendale Community Plan. Rezoning that would add requirements, restrictions, and/or incentives to promote affordable housing through that. And particularly around transit zones and areas where there's enough open space and circulation. So that'll be coming back.
That'll be coming back to South Glendale Plan. We think SB 540 and AB 73 are tools that we can implement to help prop this up. We also want to start looking outside the box for different ideas, but we need to vet those not only with finance, but legal as well. So we'll come back to those.
And then you heard some discussion, if you've had some deliberations already on the accessory dwelling unit ordinance, that's coming back to you in January, a proposal for a permanent ordinance. And then you'll be making that move, and that will be considered a land use tool with the ability to address affordable housing. In terms of legislative reform, another idea and discussion that the city council has had and will be coming back to them in the new year would be information about the right to lease ordinance. It's a proposal that was being considered, an amendment to the just cause eviction ordinance that would mandate that landlords offer tenants one-year lease agreements along with an option year for a second year with both the initial lease and the option year rent predefined in the agreement. Kind of like the commercialization of a residential unit in terms of lease terms. The intent is to allow tenants to know their rent levels for an extended period of time. We've done some outreach over the summer to both landlords, stakeholders, and residents, and we have information to bring back and discuss with the authority on that in January. Under legislative platform, we'll continue to address the Section 8 program, and we're calling it really Section 8 protection. Do what we can to ensure that there's enough money to be able to fund our vouchers that we have here. Continue as a high performer rating in terms of it being an agency. That'll help other operations and ease some of the restrictions that we have when we are high performer. We intend to come before the Housing Authority in the new year with some proposed amendments to our Section 8 administrative plan. We haven't done that in a long number of years, and we think it's time to update some of our procedures. And we'll be bringing those before you and explaining why we are proposing changes to the different procedures and what we think those actions will result in terms of the operations of the program. We're going to continue to coordinate with HUD staff on the importance of Glendale Section 8 program. And we've started, and a number of you have been a part of this, is develop marketing and market incentives to encourage participation by owners. So we're limited in our funding that we're getting from the federal government. We're limited in the amount of rents that we could pay for and subsidize. What else can we do non-financially to encourage owners to participate? And we've been trying things like concierge housing services for our landlords. If they have a Section 8 tenant, then the advisor is going to be the point person for them for all city-related business, not just Section 8. We're coming up with recognition programs, and we've had a few. We are working on an expedited initial inspection process. That new owner comes on board, you want them to have a good experience at that first inspection. And we're pushing the idea of direct deposit to them. It's a great way to get your money faster. And then finally, on legislative platform, we have lobbying, and that's lobbying both for new legislative solutions and new funding. And then that's been the priority for the authority for the last few years, and it's going to continue to be proposed to continue to be a priority now.
Well, that concludes our presentation, the outline of the strategy. As we noted, there are some areas that we would like direction on. We've noted them on your score sheet, and so, Mr. Mayor, Madam Chair, we would entertain your direction, and we'll move forward based on that.
Okay. I have a few cards. I want to go to the public. J. de Brias. Did I pronounce it right? No?
Okay. There's no way you can know based on how it's spelled.
Okay.
Honorable Council, Mayor, my name is Yedidia de Vries. I rent, work, and...
I knew that. I was just testing you to see.
I hope I passed. I rent, work, and vote here in the city of Glendale, and I'm also a member of the Glendale Tenants Union. I appreciate that the council is trying to grapple with this pressing issue of affordable housing, and I would especially like to thank staff for putting together such a thorough and informative presentation. However, I am surprised and dismayed that after reading the 34-page report and listening to the hour-and-a-half presentation, no one has mentioned rent control or rent stabilization as a potential legislative platform. This is an issue that has arisen before the council before. You have heard from many residents that this is what they ask for. We have also mentioned there was outreach around the right to lease ordinance, and both the tenants union and I know many other renters in the city replied with, "That's lovely, you're handing us a parasol when we're drowning and we actually need a life preserver." I hope that the council will take this opportunity to ask staff, to give staff direction, to agendize and look into a potential rent stabilization ordinance as an essential part of an affordable housing package. As the graph that we saw at the beginning showed, there's a shortfall of affordable housing, just as there's a surfeit of luxury housing in the city. Yes, we need more housing, but really what we need is more affordable housing. And as the city's own data shows, 59% of renters in the city are currently paying more than a third of their income towards rent. Right? I appreciate everything that's going on here, but there's a big part of this picture that was missing today. And I hope that council can address that. That's all. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. You too. Next speaker is Margarita Bagdasarian, followed by Catherine York.
Good afternoon, Mayor Garbetian and council members and staff. My name is Margarita. I'm the Community Outreach Director of ANCA Glendale, and I'm here today because the issue of affordable housing is very important to the Armenian American community, and it's also one of our priorities coming up this year. And we've discussed and met with staff to talk about this issue. We also had a community forum on affordable housing last week, and Zara Sinanian was on the panel, and Paula attended, so thank you very much for coming. And we welcome the effort made by the Housing Authority to address this issue, and we want to urge City Council and staff to utilize every method possible, whether that's looking at this report or utilizing any open space that Glendale has in order to alleviate this problem and create affordable housing in Glendale. We reviewed the affordable housing strategy, and we like the idea of creating some kind of a source of revenue, whether that is through the development impact fee, the in-lieu fee, or some kind of a commercial fee. We think that together with the housing package from the state, we can use those funds that are generated by the city to create more affordable housing units. Additionally, implementing a citywide inclusionary zoning ordinance that would require developers to set aside a percentage of units for low-income households, as well as an ADU ordinance that isn't capped at a small amount, that has a wider range for square footage. I think together those things can help create more affordable housing units without really making much of a cost for the city. Lastly, the right to lease ordinance that can create a lot of security for renters, and that would include people that are low income and also renters that are not low income, but they still need that stabilization of their rent and make it a lot easier for them to rent in the city and not worry about any major rental spikes in the middle of the year. We hope that the city can conduct any of these tests and any of these studies that need to be done in an expedited fashion and use all kind of creative avenues to be able to do so. And we look forward to having some comprehensive affordable housing strategy implemented as soon as possible, because this is an issue that everybody in Glendale is concerned with. Thank you.
Thank you. Catherine Yorka?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I know the state, to a significant degree, is forcing your hand, but I'm really grateful to you all for your attention to this matter. Since I was here, I wanted to express support for some kind of mandatory affordable housing component, which I guess is the inclusionary zoning plan. I do think that 15% is probably too low. That means out of 20 units, 3 would have to be affordable. And I've seen projects that involve the demolition of 3 small houses for a new development. And I've seen at DRB meetings the tenants, the lower income tenants who occupy those houses, coming to the meeting in concern about their future. And if you imagine that scenario, even if that project has the 3 units that the developers agreed to provide, all you're doing is replacing the existing units. You're not adding to them. And of course, if it has 0 affordable units, you're just sending those 3 people out to a very uncertain rental market. I also did wonder about the absence of any discussion of rent control, given that there had been a petition where, I can't remember how many, but it was 9,000 or 10,000 people had signed. So clearly, that's an important issue to people in the community. So, I think it would be nice to hear some of the arguments about it. But anyway, thank you for your time and thank you for considering this.
Thank you. That was my last card. Now it's time for us to discuss and give directions as to what we would like to see at the study that the city has to conduct. Go ahead.
Sure. I have a question before I begin on the 15%. Was it mentioned that if we go higher than a 15% quota on this inclusionary housing, that would have to go to the state for permission?
Correct.
Is it,
That's correct.
And
That's my understanding.
is it difficult to succeed in doing that?
We don't know, because this is the first time the state's required inclusionary ordinances. You ask them for other things related to housing, and it is difficult.
But wait, so they want us
Yeah.
to create more affordable, inclusionary housing, but they're making it difficult by forcing us
keep
to
in mind
take...
from the administration standpoint, and David may have referenced this, the governor was not a big fan of inclusionary housing, so he wanted this as a
So this may
sort
be
of
a
a look over
temporary
the
thing.
shoulder type of deal for inclusionary.
I think they're concerned it would be a ruse to stop development by factoring in some
I
large
see.
number.
I
Then
see.
then everyone says, well, I can't develop anymore. And then
I think one of the benefits that Glendale would have, and we kind of go back to a robust program, we meet our RENA numbers for market rate housing. So if we wouldn't need the ruse, so to speak, to say it's 20% because we don't want any market rate housing. We've already met that goal. So it may be easier for Glendale to have that approved at a higher number.
That would be to our benefit, and if we went and asked for 20%, it might be easier for us to achieve that. Okay, that being said, you know, this is a very difficult conundrum that we're in, trying to find housing, develop housing, affordable housing, housing for people. And as I understand it from this report, as far as affordable housing, we're 20,000 units short. So I think it behooves us, the council, to do something about it, to act and to act now. The question was asked, why haven't we addressed rent control? I want to suggest that, and I have suggested this to staff, that we have a task force put together of all of the stakeholders, that tenants union, the renters, the landlords, the realtors, everyone in this community represented, that could come together at a table. And I said, have we done this before? Well, we've met with this group and we've met with that group, but we've never brought them all together. Well, I think it's time for us to bring them together, to collaborate, and to, again, think outside the box. I think a lot of people have different ideas that somehow we could develop a plan that is unique and that would work, and really move Glendale forward in some process of controlling rents without really having rent control and providing affordable housing and housing for everybody. So let's bring everybody to the table as soon as possible and start talking and start coming up with ideas to further this process. I'm totally in agreement with the inclusionary zones. I'm glad that ordinance is going to kick in January, and maybe we can bring it back, take a look at it, have council and the Housing Authority tweak it so that it's, or we can hire the consultant that you're saying that we need. And while we're doing that, I think we should also look at impact fees. I think this has been a long time coming. You know, the horse may be out of the barn, but, and going back to that task force, and speaking of thinking outside the box, one of the landlords suggested that what we could do is implement like $100 fee to each landlord per apartment unit. So that would mean that the large developments that have like 300 apartments, they would pay $100 a year fee for each apartment, which I think amounts to someone do the math for me, 30,000, or is it
300 would be 30.
$30,000. We would put it into an affordable housing fund, and as that grows, we could do more. We would have more funds for affordable housing. This comes from landlords. So when they get to the table, something like this might happen. You just don't know. If you have 4 units, it's $400, and it's not much. But it's an idea, and it's kind of thinking, again, of different avenues. So the task force, I'm for inclusionary housing. I'm also for those impact fees, and I would like also, and if we need to hire a consultant, I think that's what we need to do. I want to see this come back to council. And also, I think we need to look at workforce housing. I think that's important as well. In other words, every avenue that we have, I think we need to look at. We need to move forward and take every opportunity that we can. And of course, the legislation we have to keep after Sacramento to help us with the funding And hopefully, one of these days, we'll actually see that happen. So that's my
Okay.
Mr. Mayor, before others comment, just to clarify, we cannot have both an impact fee and inclusionary housing. You could have an impact fee on commercial and inclusionary on residential, but you can't have both on residential.
right, and that's why I asked Mr. Zovac about that, so that we could talk about both of those and implement them in a way that is legal and fair.
So, John,
But we can say this one or the other one, the developer can take, whether to pay impact fee or inclusionary housing.
Well, if you might do inclusionary housing, and then you have to provide an in lieu fee.
Right.
So in lieu of doing the inclusionary housing, you would pay the in lieu fee. Or you would have an impact fee, and it's really about control. Do you want the dollars? And you decide where they get spent, how they get spent, how many units you do with it, or do you want the private sector to build it and put it into their units and distribute it around the city? Basically what it comes down
All right, now what I want to say is on chart 11, it has said that 1,446 units has been built, or actually 72 of them are in process. So when we divide this with 42 years, there affordable housing been around in Glendale since 1975. So it's 42 years. It's just like 36 units per year. It averaged 36 units, including the ones which we did not have developed yet. So this is like nothing. I mean, imagine there is each unit which we provided, average 3 people are living in each unit. It comes to 100 person. We are helping 36 families or 100 person in a city of 201,000 people. This is unbelievable. We have to do something quick, and we have to do fast. We have, I don't know how many hundreds of units. We have deficit of hundreds of units of affordable housing. And I don't know, this is, rent control is knocking the apartment owners' doors. So maybe they want to come forward and help us too. But I have another suggestion also. I was going to suggest when you study about, like revenues which to come to allocate to affordable housing, I want to ask if you can look into a situation that whatever property is sold in Glendale, the property is sold in Glendale to ask for 1% to be allocated to affordable housing. Like if, let's say, a limit of $2 million. So I don't want those who have small houses to be hurt because they have 400,000 units, worth of 400,000 property. So how about like 1.5 million and above, or 2 million and above, to pay 1% fee? I don't know what kind of fee, impact fee, whatever fee, that goes toward affordable housing. Let's assume if you set it to $2 million, so if the property is sold $2.1 million, they pay $1,000. If it's sold for $3 million, it will be $10,000. So toward affordable housing. I just want to, if you are studying, you are doing something, maybe see if how that's going to fit in this. For now, this is what I wanted to say.
and maybe, do you want me to address that briefly? My understanding of Prop 13 is that would probably violate Prop 13. We're capped at what property taxes can be imposed on property, including at point of sale. So I don't think that's something we could do, but I will look into it for sure to make sure that there's no way we can utilize property tax revenue in that manner.
I'm trying to do some calculation if
Sorry.
Above 2 million, that's sort of $1.5 million.
No, if it's 2.1 million, I just wanted to quickly, and I'll get to you really quick. I'm sorry.
1,000.
No,
1% over $2 million.
1 second.
Or
It's
1.5.
21,000.
Yeah, 1,000.
It's 21,000. 1% of 2.1 million is 21,000.
No. I'm saying property, whatever property is sold over $2 million, they pay 1% above $2 million.
1%, so 1% of $100,000.
Right, which will be $1,000. If they sold it $3 million, will be $10,000.
We can't do that, you guys.
Okay, we'll get to it. Let's go to your.
They're studying it. They can study
I
it
don't-
and come back.
Can't study something that's illegal.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Let me get right down to it. I think we all agree, as Mr. Sinanian stated, that affordable housing is critically important. In Glendale, I think it's extra important because the shift of demographics in the rising housing market in some ways is changing the fabric of our current community. We have a lot of senior Armenians, low-income Armenians, disabled Armenians, as well as other nationalities as well, who are being forced out. We all agree on that, and that's something we can all see. But let me get down to it. I definitely support the development impact fee. I definitely support the inclusionary zoning ordinance. And of course, as Phil said, you can't do both on the residential, but on the commercial, let's put the impact fee, providing we can make that nexus, which our consultant will do. The inclusionary zoning ordinance, yes. And those are the two issues that I'm very strong on at this point. So I support that.
Mr. Sinani.
Yeah, I mean, what my colleague said, it's a serious problem we're having to deal with, and the sooner we deal with it, the better, because it's not going to get any easier in the future. You know, one thing I was thinking, it's interesting that we could sort of be a trendsetter and say, you know what, we're going to build more and more and more, and we're going to have an impact on this terrible shortage of housing throughout the state. But the sad reality is that unless everyone else joins in and does what we did over the last 4, 5, 6 years by building a significant amount of housing in Glendale, unless everyone else is doing it, we're not really having a regional impact. I mean, unless everyone's doing it, it's a losing battle on our part. But what can we do? Again, I am also for the impact fee. Yes, I understand we can't do both on residential. Inclusionary zoning, absolutely. I don't think we can do this $100 from, you know, the suggestion from the landlord is it's deceptive, because any contribution by any landlord, any contribution is going to be translated into a higher rent for the residents. It's going to get passed on to the renters. So it's not them who will be paying it, it'll be the renters who will be paying it. And what's the point? Why would we do that?
Well, my point was actually that landlords are willing to come to the table and make suggestions like that. Whether it's taken or not, it's just that they're willing to
And we
discuss.
encourage them to make all kinds of suggestions, but ones that are not really going to impact their pocket are not going to be implemented, I think. So that's it. I mean, it's hard to sort of give direction to staff that's very targeted and very narrowly tailored, just because the scope of the problem is so big, and I think we want to retain a degree of flexibility as a council in dealing with this issue. So I think staff has enough direction to come back with an effective or workable product for us to deal with.
We have some of the big picture items, inclusionary impact fee. We can get started on that. Some of the more nuanced controls within each of those programs, something we'll have to come back for. If you do have ideas on the dollars that we have today, would you like us just to continue on a first come, first serve, bring you? Or is there specific areas of town that you'd like for us to go look for properties Are there certain types of projects you'd like us to seek out developers, family, senior, or would you like to continue the method we've used on a first-come, first-served basis? That's,
Do all of the above.
Oh, of
Look
course,
for it,
given,
then find, and
so I mean, we'll continue to bring you opportunities as they come. If there does become a specific part of the city that you would like us to look for opportunities to build affordable housing, we would like to know that so that we certainly can meet your desire. But we'll continue to bring opportunities as they present themselves. Certainly, if any of you become aware of properties that we could develop for affordable housing, pass them to staff, and Mike Fortney will jump on it, and we'll start to work it up for you.
and when you say properties to develop, I assume that also includes existing properties that we can
Sure.
rehab into
Sure.
affordable housing. I mean,
Acquisition
there was a
rehab.
short list that staff had at least a year ago. You had a list, and I understand and share my colleagues, Councilmember Alajanyan's concern that when you look at sort of the last 40 years of low-income housing history Glendale's had, the number is modest. So as we look towards and gear towards the groundbreaking for Fifth and Sonora, it'd be nice to have the next thing in line so that we can say, okay, we're groundbreaking, but that's not the end of the story. Here's the next project that we're going to start processing. It would be nice to do that. I think it's healthy to have a pipeline, as short as it may be, but have one, so that we can concentrate on that and look forward towards the next step.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Sinanian. On page 12, slide 24, I just want to go back to it and mention that first come, first serve, some developers, they're just affordable housing builders for seniors. We don't want to, and anywhere in the city is fine. Prioritizing it, I think, any kind of, all of the above, as it was mentioned, I think it's very important to grab on every opportunity that we have. I want to mention something about rent control. The rent control issue is a huge issue in the city. We all know that. Don't think that this council is not aware of it. We meet with residents every Tuesday. Every Tuesday, our door is open. 5, 6, 7, 8 people. We meet individually each with people who can't pay their rent. Yeah. So, but if you cannot pay your rent today, you won't be able to pay the same rent tomorrow. And the reason is rent control is not going to reduce the amount of the rent. I want to make sure that the community is aware of this, because there are different ideas are floating around that if there's a rent control tomorrow in Glendale, they're going to reduce your rent from $1,500 to $800. That's not going to happen. There will be a base for it. Usually they go back a year and make that a base and start from there. If you have an issue paying your rent today, you will have an issue paying your rent tomorrow. So the biggest complaint that I get every time I meet with people is not just the rents are going up. They know rents are going up everywhere. The rents in Glendale, Tahanga, Pasadena, Burbank, LA, it's all going. LA has rent control, and the rents went up 6.1% last year versus Glendale 4.3%. But the issue is the number of times that the rents are being increased. When they increase your rent 3-4 times a year, then you have a problem adjusting your life to that. So that lease to right ordinance may address some of the issues that we've been talking about, and it's coming back in January. So I want to encourage you to, because we met with some of the members of your group, and they were not really interested in even looking at that issue. But I just want to bring that up in a short, few sentences. Type of housing, it has to be housing for our community. It has to be a housing that for our residents, that our residents can occupy today and the future generation can occupy tomorrow. Not just a one-sided, one type of a housing. Every development has to have a different unit mix. We're not trying to dictate, build all 3 bedrooms, but build a combination of 1 bedroom, 2 bedrooms, and 3 bedrooms for housing, for me to really be very attractive. I mean, I'm in agreement with my colleagues about inclusionary housing as well as looking into the development impact fees. And some of the developers, they were talking about, you know, we have this parks fees at this time, the development impact fees for parks and arts. What they were saying is, when they pull their permits, we ask them to pay that fee in advance. So they're saying, let us pay that before we get our what do we call it? The completion, sign off for the entire project before we get our project signed off. We pay at the end, so we don't have to come up with a big dollar amount in the beginning, so we can complete our project. Then they can finance it. That's something that we can look into for the development impact fees that we have today, as well as the one that's coming up for affordable housing. Workforce housing. I think we need to look into the definition of workforce housing. Right now, the median income is $51,000, and workforce housing, you can have 165% of your median income, and that would determine, that's the workforce housing that they can provide workforce housing for that income level. And that will translate into $7,000 a month income. And if you put 30% of your income towards rents, that's $2,300 to $2,500. That is not affordable housing. That is not even workforce housing to me. That is market rate. That's what they are right now. One bedrooms are $2,100 to $2,500. So we need to look into the definition of the workforce housing. Maybe go with the state's definition, which is 125%. That will reduce it to $1,500 a month rent instead of $2,400, because when the developer comes here and tells us that we want to build workforce housing in South Glendale somewhere because it's close to transit, and the rents are going to be $2,400 minimum, that is market rate project. It's not a affordable housing project. The 15% inclusionary housing, I'm okay with that. I think we need to look into it. And two questions I have for my colleagues are, do we want to have a limit on where does this inclusionary housing kick in as far as the number of units? Do you want to have a limit, like if you're 20 or 30 units and above, or you want to add that to a 6-unit apartment building as well? Because I think the smaller developers, or they're not developers, there are people who purchase properties to build 6 to 8 units for the last 30 years, and then we're adding an inclusionary housing on them. So I think we need to have a floor as maybe 30 units or 40 units and above for this to be implemented on. That's one question I have. And also, it was mentioned in the report something in the lines of pipeline projects. I don't think, if you don't have your permits today, you're not in a pipeline to me. So we need to make sure that message is loud and clear. So if there are projects coming up in next year, they're applying some projects, or if they came and to the city and spoke about the project or what have you, this will apply to them. I just want to make sure that we are all on the same page, because when you say pipeline, then a lot of projects will come in before this is approved, and I don't think it's right. So if the permits is not obtained, whatever we make a decision on will apply to that project.
I support that, Mr. Mayor. I support that in terms of no pipeline. If you don't have the building permit, we're changing. In terms of the number of units for which it should apply to, I haven't really thought about that, and perhaps that's a discussion we can have when we get the consultant's report.
Right.
So picking up on that point, I also support the idea of, as a matter of principle, the smaller buildings, so something below, I think you said 30 units. I agree that these are mostly basically like retirement projects for individuals. It's their nest egg. I don't know that those are the ones that we're targeting, so I would set that as the benchmark for Because, just because there's smaller buildings, you know, if.
No, I understand, but if it's not part of this report, or when it comes back, this is just directions.
Yeah.
If it's not part of the report, then it would apply to everything, when we
Well,
pass
so
it.
I'm agreeing with you that
Right,
it should be
okay.
part of the
Can
report.
I add to it? I guess Burbank, in this respect, have a chart which they provided, staff provided to us. It says, in lieu fee schedule, and it says 5 to 9 units, they consider the smaller figure. And then 10 to 13 goes higher. 14 and above goes higher figures. So I think if we would have something like that, will be better. Starts with 5 to 9, then 10 to 13, and 14 and above. So maybe we want to categorize it like that.
That will be part of the report, and
Yeah,
at the end, we
that's
will
what I'm
make a
saying. They
decision
can-
as
So if you would like that, we will build some alternatives in for you.
Yes.
As well as setting it maybe a higher floor, but charging a fee to those below.
In all this, I would caution our colleagues to not adopt such stringent requirements where it just stifles any and all
Right, that's not
construction
the
development in Glendale. That's not the intention. And one question also I want to put out there for my colleagues' consideration. Does all of this apply also to ownership? I mean, does this apply to condos as opposed to apartments? Are we making this blanket for everything? I would think.
It should be condos. Recently, they make condos and then they rent them out. So why we have to exclude any condos?
Well, condos, I mean, the only reason I think of it as a separate category is because no one's built condos in Glendale for a long time. And there's a need for those. And again, anything that we adopt today is going to have an impact on persons or business people's, developers' willingness to invest in Glendale and create those. So I think condos on some level need to be treated a little differently than apartment units.
If we categorize like the other one, that if it's few, charge less, and when it goes higher, because I know there are condos built in here which they're going to rent it out now.
And if I may, Mr. Mayor, members of council, just remember, this is the first step in the process, so those features
We can
can
tweak
come
this.
back especially when we engage the consultant, he or she can advise what impacts these projects, these requirements may have on the different levels of the projects.
Right, and
especially
I agree
ownership.
with both my colleagues on condo issues. Most of the projects are being built to condo specs, but they're not subdivided. But that doesn't mean that they're for sale, they're for rent. But some projects are built, subdivided first, at the same time, and built as condos, and they're for sale products. Those are the ones that I think Mr. Sinanian is indicating, that the ones that are for sale to look at it differently. But as this report comes back, we can look at different options and see which. And another issue is entry-level ownership housing. If you're building condos, entry-level ownership housing, that is the key. If we want to give incentives to developers, give it to the ones that provide entry-level ownership housing, so people can move from apartments that are renting and purchase a property, a condominium, so these apartments will free up for the rest of them to rent. That's another way of increasing our number of apartment rental units. So with that, any other questions, comments?
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to ask for some clarification and ask for the city attorney to chime in if necessary as it relates to the conversation you just brought up as it relates to pipeline projects versus those that have already pulled permits. I think we need some level of direction as it relates to that today, if at all possible. I know that Councilmember Najarian was also interested in that, but staff, Phil's shop will get a number of questions for those who are in some sort of pipeline status.
For San Fernando.
Wondering, what's going to happen.
Or San Fernando?
Right, so remember, we have the ordinance in place for inclusionary for San Fernando that, as Peter explained, will essentially come January 1st, will be effective again for those projects. And there's a few projects that have either are in the pipeline or have their design review approval already. So that's the question.
On San Fernando Road?
In the corridor, that redevelopment corridor, which actually comes down and South Glendale touches that. South Brand, South Central, they all touch that. So there's some projects that are down in that southern part of the corridor that would be affected by this.
So that would occur immediately on January 1st.
January
In that
1st.
region, because we've already had the ordinance in place, and now
Right,
it would be our decision to do that. I would say yes. And then the others, we need to,
Right, the others that they don't have a building permit anywhere else, that this, whatever we make a decision on next year will apply to them.
I'm assuming that you all are aware, but I feel the need to just mention it. A lot of the development that is taking place was all geared towards existing rules, and we would be putting a new rule in that they did not anticipate. Again, I'm assuming that you're all aware of that.
We
And
are
if you
aware
want-
of that, but let me
If the
just.
policy to go forward, we'll do that.
Right, I think that's the policy, but this council has been talking about these issues for the last few months. It's not that we came up with this issue today. So it was the same way with the development impact fee for parks and fees, and this is nothing new. So we've been talking about this issue, and I think if you don't have your building permit, whatever decision we make will apply to that project.
Would we require a motion to that?
No, because it's essentially keeping the rule in place, the ordinance in place, and what you're saying is you don't want another action to put that on hold while we're considering this citywide. That'll take effect come January 1st.
it'll be automatic.
It'll
If
be
we don't do
automatic.
anything, it'll be automatically starting
make
January
sure.
1st.
Right.
Okay.
Because that was our rule to begin with.
Yeah.
And then this lawsuit, the Palmer lawsuit, said we can't apply that to rental. Now the state legislation lifts that effective January 1st. So if the idea is no pipeline, then we don't need to take an affirmative act.
Right. Okay.
And the other was, Councilmember Devine brought up the task force. There's only one of you that brought it up, but we just want to have clarification to know, is that a direction you want to go? Or move forward with bringing a report back to you once the staff and consultant have done some of these studies to see what the pleasure is, or have the task force. That's up to the council in terms of that direction.
The task force is essentially to bring all of the stakeholders together to discuss rent control, the lease ordinance that we're talking about, or maybe come up with a different idea on how we can deal with the current problems that they're having. Because this
I
is
don't
all
think
of
it's a
the,
bad idea, but perhaps once we get some of the reporting information to us and we sort of get a clear idea as to which direction.
They can look into it too, whoever will study this.
So.
Good idea, but I
pleasure.
don't think we need to do it right now. I would support it maybe in January,
well,
February.
you have this, my reason for wanting to do it now is that you have this group that's really fighting to get this on the ballot, and you know, it's really very important to all of them. It's a lot of people. And then on the other side, you have the landlords that are willing to try to do something, and maybe they can come up with some sort of a idea, solution, remedy, suggestion. And what would it hurt? What would it hurt to have them get together at the table?
My reluctance is that whatever the end product of this task force's activities are, it's going to be skewed. It's going to be a result that more heavily represents the interests of the landlords, because, you know, thankfully we have these new organizations that are tenant oriented, but the landlords are better financed, they're better organized, they have statewide representation, they're you know,
lawyers and
they're going, I'm afraid they're going to be overwhelmingly audible in this task force.
Well, but I think with the task force, we're not saying that whatever they decide we're adopting, or that, Mr. Levesque, do you want to chime in on this and what your feelings are? Because I think you would probably be the one that would call them together. Do you?
I could refer to a task force that was established back in 2001, maybe for reference. At that time, there was a similar discussion going on, and a task force was put together. They were in process for over a year that they met and deliberated, and then came back with a recommendation that a year or so later, maybe even 2 years, the just cause eviction ordinance came out of that. So that task force did meet. There were a number of issues that they looked at. There were a number of suggestions they had that didn't really pan out. There was a voluntary mediation program that was established and quickly folded at that time. So there's been one before in the past, but in order to be effective, it did take over a year of them meeting and deliberating before recommendations going back to council. So whether or not that would take a similar amount of time for this group, I don't know.
I think the best venue is this chambers. The right to lease ordinance is coming back. Both groups can come in and voice their opinion, and also about rent control, they can come in and voice their opinion. When the report comes back for the inclusionary housing and everything else, it can come, because when we try to referee these meetings, then it gets sometimes out of hand, and it's not an easy task to handle. I don't have a problem with it, but I think if there is an interest for two sides to sit down and talk, this is the best venue for it. So, but we'll look into it early next year, in January or so, see if that's the way of going. But today, I think, before we have any information as far as the report goes, I don't know. We'll see. Okay.
I think we have our direction.
Okay, just a quick comment,
Yes.
Mr. Mayor. I know that Mr. Najarian, in sort of going through a list of groups that are impacted, several times said Armenian, elderly, and I think I just want to make sure it's not an ethnic thing. It so happens that I think immigrant communities are more economically susceptible, and they're less, they're not as established as those that have been here much longer. So in Glendale, that happens to be, in large part, the Armenian population. So I think that's what you meant, right?
Oh, yeah, that's...
But this is a problem that's afflicting, again, every economically, again, susceptible group throughout California. And that's what we're trying to address.
Right, thank you for that. What's next on do you have enough information and direction?
Move to adjourn?
Second.
We have one more item.
One more item. There's a couple, actually.
This is for, would you read that into it? Do we have to, can we continue this meeting and go to that item, or we have to adjourn from this and open the meeting again? Or 1A on the meeting, a special meeting?
Can
I just go to that?
Receive and file, right?
No, there is another
There's
special
a Glendale
meeting.
Economic Development meeting.
That's what I said. No,
Okay, let's,
The joint meeting.
I move to adjourn.
Yeah, and
And that's second.
Councilmember Sines, second.
we are
For
adjourned.
council, I move to adjourn for housing.